Just last week, a courtroom showdown with all of Hollywood watching to determine if Randall Miller would become the first director in the history of the movie business to go to jail for a death on the set.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. The legal outcome to the 2014 film Midnight Rider, a biopic on musician Greg Allman starring William Hurt, was very, very different to that of The Crow. Like Rust, Midnight Rider was cancelled after tragedy struck on day one of shooting, when the entire crew literally had to run for their lives off a bridge as a freight train approached. One crew member, Sarah Jones, I think she was 27 years old, she was the camera assistant. She failed to clear the bridge, was struck and died. 6 other crew were injured. Before we get to the rest of this episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So ironically, the entire crew waited for 2 trains to pass. So they actually saw these trains passing before setting themselves up on the bridge. By being on site and seeing the trains pass, those in charge of the production had to have realized just how dangerous the setup was. The scene called for William Hurt to lay on a hospital bed set up across the railway track on the bridge. Curiously, in the spiel of the film, Hurt's character hallucinates something about not being allowed or able to cross the bridge. As it turned out, director Randall Miller didn't have permission to film the scene on the bridge. The director and 3 other filmmakers were eventually indicted on involuntary manslaughter and criminal trespassing. Miller was sentenced to 2 years in county jail, 8 on probation, and a $20,000 fine. Interestingly, both the film director and the executive producer pled guilty, while the assistant director waived her right to a jury trial and decided instead to have a judge decide her case. The filmmakers also faced several civil lawsuits from fellow crew members. And now let's go to the intertextuality of an approaching train. And there were some people in a previous video who complained saying, you didn't invent the term intertextuality, it's in the dictionary. I never claimed that I did invent the term. I did claim that I am the first to use the term intertextuality in the context of true crime, comparing true crime scenarios, true crime patterns to one another. So is there anything more inevitable, think about it, than an approaching train? You see it coming, you hear it, and if there's one object that can't deviate from its course, it's a freight train. A few years ago, I was traveling through Namibia and I decided to photograph a freight train that was moving fairly slowly across the landscape. I was sort of chasing it in my vehicle. Only after the train passed did I realize just how painfully close I came to being smashed from the front because I'd underestimated the width of the sort of bumper, the sort of front area of the train. I guess it's used to clear the track of sand, right? Because it is a kind of a desert train. And so it was a lot wider than the train track. And so at the last moment, as I'm taking these photos of the train approaching, I sort of felt the wind just pass by my cheek, and that is how close this train came to striking me. And, you know, there's a scenario where you see the train, you're aware of it, and you underestimate it. Now consider the intertextuality between the filmmakers on Midnight Rider seeing the 2 trains passing and pursuing their scene on the track regardless, and then compare that to the filmmakers on Rust facing one quote-unquote accidental discharge after one another and pursuing their scene regardless. It's kind of similar, isn't it? In the same way that you see the train in the distance, these quote-unquote accidental discharges are like something that is approaching and coming closer in an inevitable way. Does that make sense? So in this respect, I think Rust feels like it has more in common with Midnight Rider, wouldn't you say? And then there are other similarities as well. One of them is the script revision aspect. According to news.com.au, an Australian news source, there was an attempt to change the script regarding the portion that ultimately cost a crew member her life. And this is a quote from the article. The district attorney said Miller and the other filmmakers attempted to rewrite the script to drop the scene they planned to shoot with actor William Hurt in the role of Allman in a hospital bed placed on the tracks. But Miller decided to shoot the scene anyway, Johnson said, after the owner of the property surrounding the tracks said the movie crew could access its land. He said Miller and his crew went onto the railroad bridge after mistakenly thinking no more trains would pass that day. And I think there's an analogy in the mistakenly thinking no more trains would pass that day and mistakenly thinking, well, how many dummy rounds are in the gun? You know, you should really check and make absolutely sure. You should do your due diligence, shouldn't you? I mean, if you're going to put other people's lives at risk, shouldn't you make absolutely sure of safety issues? And I think you can see how the thinking goes here. We don't really have permission, but we can probably get away with it. And that brings us to the next section, violation of protocol. Johnson said all three defendants knew that CSX Transportation, which owned the trestle spanning the Altamaha River that's in Georgia, had denied them permission in writing to film on its tracks, right? So these people knew that they didn't actually have permission to do what they were doing. They knew it, and they did it anyway. And I think this is the pertinent part, that other crew members were unaware that the filmmakers were refused permission. The other crew members were clearly, deliberately left in the dark. And so the question is on Rust, were the producers aware of safety issues? And if so, didn't they have a duty to inform? Didn't have a duty to inform just as the filmmakers did in Midnight Rider, to inform them what they knew and what they didn't do. So did they know about safety issues, and did they inform the crew in a complete way, or were they holding certain things back? It seems very unlikely that if Halyna Hutchins was painfully aware of safety issues, especially around gun discharges, that she would direct someone to aim at her. And then we come to the next point, whose job is safety? According to one source, now we're going to answer the question about whose responsibility safety was on the Midnight Rider set. And so according to one source, quote, Hurt was on the tracks when the train approached. And he said, quote, I just had this unsettled feeling from the very first time I got there. I stopped everything and I said in front of everybody, I said, stop. And I asked Assistant Director Hilary Schwartz in front of the whole crowd, are we safe? Because it's her job as the first AD to tell us that. And she said yes, end quote. In Rust, safety was the Assistant Director Dave Hall's responsibility. A legal question is whether Halls did in fact announce the firearm loudly to the crew inside the church as cold gun, when we know in fact it wasn't. We also know it wasn't checked properly. In this sense, we see a striking potential real-life intertextuality between the two productions, where the assistant director assures the crew that conditions are safe when they aren't, and due to being misled, a fatality is the immediate result. And one thing that is really interesting about this is, in the Midnight Rider scenario, although Hilary Schwartz sort of said things were safe, and you had the actor William Hurt question that, Another crew member was also concerned. I think it was the hairstylist. And she says she regrets to this day not speaking up to address her concerns about the safety issues. And so one wonders whether that wasn't the case as well on Rust. And if it was the case, why do you think someone wouldn't raise their concerns if they did have those concerns?
I'm mad at myself because I didn't say something.
Another very interesting intertextuality to draw between the scenario in Midnight Rider and Rust is this idea of not knowing something for hours, and someone's got to explain to you what happened in a particular situation. And so, did William Hurt have no idea what had happened for hours? Actors and filmmakers, I think, need to be particularly observant in order to represent reality. They've got to pay attention. If you take Baldwin, for example, imitating Trump, you've got to pay attention to those little nuances, how he speaks, how he moves, how he carries himself, how he pouts with his mouth, all those little details. And I was recently struck by Baldwin's detailed account, spanning almost 13 minutes in a recent Instagram video. I'm sure many of you have seen it, but he goes into such microscopic detail about certain things. I mean, watch that Instagram to get what I'm talking about. Personally, and this is just my opinion, I thought it was quite superficial and self-indulgent. I think he was trying to be deep and meaningful and somber and all those kind of things, but I didn't really get the feeling it was very, I just thought it was quite superficial. But I also thought it revealed Baldwin's attention to detail. And it made me wonder, did Baldwin really not know about the strife bedeviling the production? Did he really not know about the other things that were going on? And when he was at the center of the shooting in the church in particular, did he really have no idea what had happened? Wouldn't it have been obvious to everyone what had happened? And so if you take that question and you apply it to Midnight Rider and William Hurt, well, William Hurt has spoken about it. He's spoken about what happened and what he experienced. And so, William Hurt feared what might happen before it happened. And he said something about that, right? And then exactly what he feared happening did happen. But not only that, when it was happening, when this incident was happening, he knew it was happening. So while it was taking place, he knew it was happening. He knew what was happening before it happened, and also while it was happening. And so according to one source, when asked how much time they had to get off the tracks, Hurt was told that they'd have about 60 seconds. And this is what he said in response to that. He said, quote, "And I said in front of everybody, 60 seconds is not enough time to get these people and this equipment off this bridge. There's just no way. And then I looked around, thinking that the rest of the crew had all worked with her before, that's worked with the assistant director, would say something, and they didn't. They just started shambling back to work, and I thought, well, that's their vote. They trust her. So we went to work." And then what came out of the federal investigation was that the crew members were not aware that the production had twice been denied access to the trestle, and they were in fact criminally trespassing. Schwartz later yelled that a train was approaching. And the interesting thing is that it was a CSX train with identifying number Q12519. It had 2 locomotives and 37 freight cars. And then it barreled across the bridge at an estimated 57 miles per hour. And while some people thought that there'd be a minute, I think it was closer to half that. It was something like 26, 27 seconds. So basically, they heard the blaring of the horn of the train, and impact was about 26, 27 seconds later. And so Hurt went on to say, quote, "I was barefoot and I turned around, I twisted my head and I said, someone's going to die now. I tried to yank the bed up, My feet were getting clobbered by the splinters in the tires. I couldn't move the bed at all. I just started screaming, "You can't stop it! You can't stop it! You can't stop it! You can't stop it!" And I picked my way across the tires, trying not to fall to impede people climbing over me who were trying to escape too, end quote. And so there where he's saying someone's going to die now, this is actually within the situation. The situation is playing out in real time. And he doesn't think it, he says it. He says someone's going to die now. And I think, in hindsight, what some of the people could have done, probably not safe either, but they could have jumped off the bridge from where they were standing into this river. Quite a big leap, and who knows what is at the bottom, but at least they stood a chance. Instead, they were running in the same direction that the train was approaching. And even when you reach the end of the bridge section, there's kind of a steep slope to the side. And so not only that, you also had the people trying to move this bed, which they should just have abandoned. They should have just left the bed and got everyone off that bridge. And ultimately, there were a lot of people who were standing on the bridge. They couldn't get off the bridge, and so they hung on to the braces of the bridge. And some people were spared the train, but others weren't. And of course, when the bed struck, I think the assistant camera woman, Sarah Jones, and she was then run over by the train. I believe the director also narrowly escaped being run over as well. I think he was lying right next to the track when the train passed. So William Hurt goes on to say, and then I got into the rocks, and I think he means beside the bridge, and he says they were razor sharp, and I turned and I'm going, "Oh, Jesus God," and I'm looking at them. I was only a few feet away from the train and I saw them. I felt the wind buffeted and I just covered my eyes and started screaming, "No, no, 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 no." And so he knew immediately what had happened. So compare that to Baldwin's passive cerebral, "I thought to myself, did she faint?" He's surrounded by, you might say, 8 people who are very close to him, but, around about 16 people in that church. And he's thinking to himself, he's not saying anything. And actors are expressive. What did he say to his fellow crew members? He doesn't seem to say that. Did he really think that Halyna had fainted? Did he really not connect the sound of the gun, the smoke of the gun, the recoil of the gun, her falling, or the blood to the gunshot then and there? And another thing that kind of beggars belief, given what has already been said, is William Hurt saying it was simply impossible to imagine anything like that could happen. I find that amazing. You have actors who work in the world of fiction, of imagination, of possibility, and they're in a situation where almost everybody would imagine exactly what could happen and did happen. You'd imagine a train would come, right? In a scenario where you're holding a gun, right? And I must have noticed quite a few scenarios where, in movies, where someone is holding a gun to someone else and it's not loaded, apparently. I saw something like that recently in Matrix Reloaded. There's a scene in that where, and so obviously those are safety issues that need to be addressed. So one's got to think, is it possible that a gun pointed at someone could be dangerous? Is it possible putting a bunch of people on a railway track could end in disaster? And here you have William Hurt saying it was simply impossible to imagine anything like that could happen. I'm not going to play the thing that Baldwin said, but he was also saying, it was so alien, it was so impossible to believe that there could be a live round. Well, that is exactly what it was. And why is it so difficult to believe? Of course, Hurt contradicts himself because he asked prior to the incident how much time they needed to get off a bridge if a train came. As I said, he was told 60 seconds, and then the horn of the train blared just 26 seconds prior to impact. And this is the bottom line. The bottom line is, and we go to ABC News for this, quote, "It was the first time in history that a Hollywood director had been held responsible for a death on set." And this is something that happened just 7 or 8 years ago, so fairly recently. And going back to the article, quote, "It was a very big deal because in California they're invincible," said Brunswick Assistant District Attorney John Johnson. He went on to say, "It showed that directors and producers can be held responsible if a crew member dies. We take life seriously here in South Georgia, and we also take death seriously too," end quote. I think legally we're in a similar, if not the same place. The producers of Rust could, I think, be held responsible for Halyna's death in a similar manner to the filmmakers of Midnight Rider. The question is, will they? And another question is, what is Halyna's husband going to do? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.